You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do.
Welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 53. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host today, Jeb Card. And today we're talking about convergence in archaeology, or independent invention. How is it that two cultures can develop the same technology, but be completely separate from each other? Is it diffusionism? Is it aliens? Or is it just the fact that a problem across cultures can be solved in similar ways? Get ready to think critically.
You will see are a staple of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I am your host, Sarah, and I am here today with my co-host, Jeb Card. Jeb, how's it going?
Hello, doing just fine. Just listened to one of our previous interviews, sounded fantastic, and looking forward to talking about another one of our sort of bigger meta educational themes.
Yeah, this is one of my Educating Through Force podcasts. We've talked about hyperdiffusionism and diffusionism, and now I want to start breaking down some more just kind of conceptual themes in archaeology, and one of them is the concept of what I call convergence in archaeology and what Jeb refers to as independent invention in archaeology. And what we both mean by that is the development of similar traits within completely unrelated culture groups. So things like art, writing systems, religion. It can be even something as simple as a style of clothing. But if there's no known relationship between these two culture groups, and yet they're both developing a similar thing, that to me is evidence of convergence, and I think that's evidence of an independent invention across the board to pretty much any archaeologist.
Well, the convergence you're talking about, what that reminds me of is the term convergent evolution. Mm-hmm. And probably my favorite example of this. So the reason I like independent invention, because of course we're talking about things that people made.
Right.
But convergent evolution, you also see this in biology. And there's any number of examples, but my favorite is if you Google up an ichthyosaur. An ichthyosaur was one of the very first Mesozoic reptiles before the word dinosaur existed. And it wasn't a dinosaur, it was a marine reptile. But it's this marine reptile that's got two little flippers, a dorsal fin, a long nose, and a powerful tail. And if you look at this thing, you're like, that's a dolphin.
Right.
It's basically a dolphin. And it's not a dolphin. It's a marine reptile, but it lived and had the same ecological niche as dolphins do today. In fact, even today, we have two animals that are very similar. Think of your generic shark. There are sharks that have all different kinds. You know, the wobegon, which is like the carpet shark, which is weird and creepy and sits on the bottom to eat your feet. But your typical shark, your blue shark, your great white shark even, it has the basic same form as a dolphin. The tail is oriented differently, but otherwise it moves similarly. It's not all the same, but it has a lot of similarities. Are they related? Well, in the sense that they are both vertebrates, they're chordates on planet Earth, sure, but they're not any more related than that in any real sense. One's warm-blooded, one's cold-blooded, one's a fish, one's a mammal. But because they occupy similar niches with similar evolutionary pressures, the same through natural selection, through natural trial and error, the same solutions developed. And that happens in nature, happens in biology. It also happens with humans. When humans are in similar situations, they won't always come up with the exact similar kinds or somewhat similar kinds of solutions, but we really shouldn't be shocked if they do.
Right, and I am pulling the concept of convergence out of the biological realm and applying it to the archaeological realm, because I've seen it pulled out, I've seen it used in other situations as well that aren't necessarily biological. So I feel comfortable bringing that into archaeology. Yeah. And the reason that it's important that we talk about this is because a lot of times when you're talking with people on the fringe or people with alternative history, that kind of stuff, you will see them trying desperately to make pieces fit together, pieces from different cultures fit together in order to support a hypothesis that they've come up with. Eric von Daniken is notorious for this. The way he has gone through pretty much every religious book, every major religious book that he can get his hands on, and then he cherry picks details out of all of these religious books and says, see, because this book says people from the sky, and this book says God dwells in the sky, and then this book says people with wings who obviously dwell in the sky, or else why would they have wings? They're all talking about aliens. Yeah, and that's a very broad example, but it's pretty true about von Daniken's work. And
well, I think broad is actually really appropriate here, because you mentioned cherry pick. It's not just cherry picking, it's also like sanding off the differences, like sanding off the edges, where if you squint hard enough, if you blur yourself, if you have the wrong prescription glasses just enough, things start to look similar, that maybe they share some similarities, but then they will have very, very different historical backgrounds that are clearly not related to each other.
Right. And I think that's appropriation. I mean, it's the act of appropriation of a culture specifically for the purpose of supporting your confirmation bias.
Yeah, well, I think there's two things. I think there's a couple things going on here. We're going to get, I think, into a number of these. One, though, is go back to our hyperdiffusion episode that we did several weeks ago, where at one point archaeology didn't have any better answers than, well, it looks the same.
Right. And this is an argument that Ken and I have, which is fine. We're allowed to argue. That I think back when archaeology was in its embryonic phase and moving into its starting to develop into a real fields phase.
Yeah. Let's say before 1920 to some degree.
Yeah, to some degree. I am kinder to the mistakes and the weird ideas that were had at that time. I am kinder on that than Ken is, because to me, it makes sense sociologically that these things would be happening, that we would be making these erroneous ideas. It doesn't forgive the mistakes, but it's like, I can see why they were doing that.
Well, I think there's a difference between it being a mistake because no one's done anything better, and then if there's this entire field that's been dedicating so many person hours and so much work and so much sweat and tears to getting it right, and you're like, well, Nephilim.
Right, right.
It's the ignoring of it.
And that's what I feel happens now. People just ignore things.
It's a little rude.
It is.
It's really rude, actually.
It is, and that's why today I'm a whole lot less forgiving about it today than I would be from historical documents. It's why when we talk about, and we haven't quite gotten into the myth of the mound builders just yet, but we have talked about the concept that when colonial whites, Europeans started getting here to America, they refused to believe that the Native Americans were talented enough to build mounds. And so they came up with a billion other explanations as to why the mounds were there, none of which were correct.
It was also to put them in their old, they wanted to have it in the old biblical framework. They wanted to have stuff from the historical record, the classical or the biblical record here.
Right. And
because it also sort of justified them. It wasn't just that they didn't think the people, although they thought that. Yeah. But it was also to
they
make
needed it to be in a framework that they understood. Yeah. I'm not saying that is correct for the time period. I'm not forgiving the inherent racism and the confirmation bias of the it must be biblical, therefore I'm going to make it that way. I'm not forgiving that. I'm just saying it's understandable that they were drawing those conclusions. If you are going to do the exact same thing in 2017 or 2016 today, no, that's unacceptable. You should know better. Yeah, no, you're just being ignorant at that point.
We are not the only people that have touched on that. I think Garrett Fagan in the book that I think Ken and Garrett Fagan, Archaeological Fantasies, which I think was one of the inspirations for your
It is
your
the inspiration
blog
for the show, yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Fagan, in his article Diagnosing Pseudo-Archaeology, actually tackles that question. Like, was Heinrich Schliemann a pseudo-archaeologist? And the answer is
no.
A little, because was better, and he initially kind of was like poo-pooing that because he wasn't trained, and then he brought people who were trained in as he started making more errors. So it's not quite the same
I can see
thing.
that argument. I don't like Heinrich Schliemann, so screw that guy. But whatever.
Yeah. But exactly. Yeah, it's different in 1900 than in 2016.
Exactly. That's my argument. Ken is a whole, like I said, Ken forgives that at no point, which is fine. That's Ken's prerogative, and I completely respect that. So, along with the concept of convergence, one of the reasons, or independent invention, the reason why I want to talk about these two topics today is because there is a well-known phenomenon that the brain does, because I don't like the concept that the brain is stupid, because I don't feel like the human brain is stupid, even though a lot of people are trying to sell it that way just for catchy headlines.
Well, not only that, we don't really have any alternatives.
Well, and that's why I'm like, the brain's not stupid. The brain is just developed in a way to help us stay alive. And in today's modern era, with all of our technology and all of our vast knowledge, some of the things that the brain developed to do don't make sense anymore. And one of those things is a concept called apophenia, which is the tendency to perceive a connection or meaningful pattern between unrelated or random things. People may be familiar with pareidolia, which is a subset of apophenia. And that's the concept of, is it the thing that I see in the bushes? Is it the leopard, or is it just the leaves moving? Well, I'm going to go with the leopard, because if I leave and it isn't the leopard, I'm not out anything. But if I stay and it is the leopard, I'm going to get ate.
Well, there's also another part. Well, pareidolia, even more specifically, often it's not always, it's the shapes in the clouds.
Yeah, the faces in the clouds kind of thing.
But
yeah.
Faces are the most important. It has been very strongly hypothesized that the reason that that exists is that we are, primates are social generally. Mammals are often very social. Primates are really social, and humans are really, really social amongst the primates.
Right.
And it would be incredibly, seeing faces would be really important for a primate and obviously for a human. And so we see faces in everything. We see them in, if you're in your house, look at an electric outlet. Oh, look, it's a face.
Right.
Look at your car. Oh, look, it's a face. Look at your toaster. Look at your everything. We see faces. That's a little weird one, I will admit, in my speaker. But we see them everywhere, even if they're not really faces. And that's entirely adaptive and appropriate. And the fact that we see them in our toaster or in our electrical lights, or electrical outlets, it mildly amuses us. It doesn't really harm us.
Yeah, most of us can say that's not really a face. It just looks like a face.
Now, what that does get into is there's also the idea that you get into, and this might be beyond what we want to get into, but into animism, that we also apply the idea of animate action to all kinds of objects. The idea of a tree or a rock acting like a person. And we think of this, our computers. I mean, How many times have you yelled at your computer? Not even the way you yell at an animal, which is, also just don't do that. But that you would yell at a person, or you would plea with it. Like, oh, please don't. You don't really, we do that with machines because they do animate, they move. So this gets into the fact that these are frankly side effects of the human condition. And until we start monkeying with that in the next century on a far more disturbing level, and transhumanism and all of that, then, well, okay, fine. But at the moment, we aren't there. So these are side effects of being human.
Right. And like I was saying, there's a lot of people who are trying to sell psychology books and pop psychology right now by saying, your brain is stupid. I think there's even one that's titled that, Your Stupid Brain. Your brain's not stupid. This is just what your brain does.
Well, to be fair, some people.
Well, some people. All right. I'm not going there.
That,
I'm not going there.
Anyway. All right.
But, crap, you derailed me there.
Sorry.
Nah, don't worry about it.
You're saying that the brain is not stupid, even though there are books that sell this.
Right, and I don't like the concept of calling someone's brain, or calling your brain stupid. I mean, okay, what do you think makes you work? Here, call your brain stupid. You're literally telling yourself that you're stupid. I mean, that's honestly what you're doing. So let's not focus on how silly the brain is, and just accept the fact that this apophenia and that pareidolia happen. And because of that, without being aware of this bias, this natural bias that we have to see things, and make connections where there may not be any. That causes us to make some very strange connections in the world of archaeology, unless we are aware that we're doing it.
I would say all of science. All of science.
All of science, yes, but we're focusing on archaeology. So yeah, right. I mean, it's important to understand what a bias is, and that no matter how well-trained you are, how disassociated you think you are, you're biased. You just are. Deal with it. So in the field of archaeology, we run into this problem, like I said earlier, when we deal with the fringe, and we have people who are, I'm going to err on the side of caution and say they honestly believe they're seeing a connection where there is none. And then you hit the true believer wall where no matter what you say, you're not going to convince them that no, they're not seeing that connection there. It's important that we as archaeologists understand what's happening. And I feel like it's important to communicate that with our listeners, that what's happening here is they are making a connection based on things that evolved independently within the societies that they're trying to connect.
Yeah, in other words, we're going to see things in one place that may look in some ways like something in another place, and it does not mean that even though we there must be a connection, there must be a pattern, not always. And it might be. I mean, we talked about on the hyperdiffusion show, I've studied things that are very clearly tied across oceans, but in order to feel like I believe that, I had to really connect that to basically correct for my biases.
Right. And before we start getting into some of these examples, I do want to say that there are clear cases of, as we said in the diffusionism and the hyperdiffusionism episodes, there are clear cases of traits being passed on from one culture to another that are fairly well documented, or if suspected, there's a really good reason to suspect that.
There's tons of it. There's tons of things moving. I mean, that's one of my favorite. There was a show in the 1970s, I think, called Connections, that I loved watching, where the host would show up and he would start with a broken fuse and that would get him back to the Renaissance. And he would show all of the connections in the modern life to the weirdest places, because that does happen. But at the same time, there are all sorts of things that people try to argue, like, well, you mainstream scientists haven't seen it, but I can see this connection.
Right.
It's like, well.
And that's where the apophenia flaw hits. Is I can see the connection. Or the
Barnum Wall, but.
Well, yeah. The sucker born every minute.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and that's the difference between a true believer and somebody getting sucked in. We're not gonna bash anybody in particular, because that's not what we do on this show.
Well, or if we do, we make it a centerpiece of the show. But,
right. There are people I would love to go after, but yeah.
Yeah. No, this is more of a general concept show.
So let's go to break, and when we come back, we'll start looking at some specific examples of independent invention and convergence.
Jenny McNiven, host and diva of the Struggling Archaeologist's Guide to Getting Dirty, brings a witty, personal, and often musical view of archaeology. From personal experiences to just telling you about something she really loves, you'll always be informed and entertained. Listen to the Struggling Archaeologist's Guide to Getting Dirty on iTunes and Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/struggle-arc. Let's get back to the show.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
What makes for a great vacation? Depends on who you ask. Are you looking to get away or bring everyone together? Do you want to get outside and play or see a play at the plate? Fortunately, however you operate, I'm the destination you've been looking for. The name's Missouri, but you can call me Mo. And I have just one question. What's your MO? Come see me at visitmo.com.
And we are back, and we are going to look at some specific-ish examples of independent invention and convergence. And so one that Jeb has suggested, and I agree with him, is the concept is writing a concept? It's not a concept.
I would say it's a technology.
Yeah.
It's a concept. It's a technology. Yeah.
Yeah. So several early cultures all developed a system of writing. And we can
let's get to some brass tacks. Writing is the visual or physical manifestation of actual linguistic data. It's not cartoons. And this gets complicated, and I don't want to get into it. Maybe we could do this on another show.
I was going to say, we can have an argument over what writing is specifically.
Like some people are like, oh, certain kinds of things that you might call pictorial or pictographic. But generally, when we mean writing, we mean symbols that abstractly record what you could turn into spoken language. It's not interpretation. And again, there are things that are like writing that, in fact, this kind of is our point, that fit the same function, even if they're not necessarily writing. But around the globe, there have been a number of places where writing emerged independently of any other system. If you believe us, there are some people not the mainstream who would say that is not the case. But if you ask any other archaeologist, any other historian, any other epigrapher, and epigrapher is somebody who studies ancient writing, there are numerous places around the world where writing emerged independently, including Mesoamerica, basically the Maya region in Mexico, China, northern China. You also have writing. You have writing in the area we call Mesopotamia and Iraq and sort of areas around there. Now, around the same time, and they are talking to each other, you have Harappan in India and Pakistan and hieroglyphs in Egyptian, and then a bit later, Minoan writing in the Aegean. Now, they are talking to each other, so maybe the concept of it, like the basic idea that this should exist, might have been communicated, but those systems are not related. Like hieroglyphs in Egypt and cuneiform in Sumer in southern Iraq are emerging pretty much independent or pretty much identical in time, but they're not related. They're not like each other.
Right.
So this has happened several times. And it's definitely in Mesoamerica is independent, and definitely in China is independent. And this has happened repeatedly.
Right. And that's the important key there.
Yes.
It's not that you have these, I think, 5 or 6 cultures that we mentioned, and they developed writing, and then everybody else developed writing. The timelines are the important aspect here. The timelines and the appearance of these forms of writing.
Yeah. So Sumerian is about 3,500 BC. BCE. Egyptian is a little later, depending on what you define as evidence. China gets complicated because of Jiahu, but let's assume that we're talking about Shang China, so about 1500 BC. Harappan, I'd have to go back and look at my numbers, but it's several hundred years after cuneiform, and then Maya writing emerges probably around 300 to 400 BC, and there's probably Zapotec early writing, maybe around 500, but that at that point that becomes a way do we find something new. But they're all basically the same. Those in Mesoamerica around the same time. And so they're different time periods. And they also even emerge to some degree for different reasons. And we can get into that. But the fascinating part is that they all emerge in similar contexts.
Right.
In similar cultural, or really not cultural, social contexts. So just like the fact that those ichthyosaurs and those dolphins and those sharks are emerging, or they're developing their basic body form for sort of similar context, an ecological niche, if you will, when we come to cultural. These social niches are emergent elites, centralization of government, and basically early state societies. And that's where we see writing emerge again, even though, as we might talk about, it's for different reasons.
Right. And that's the important aspect is what Jeb said, is that like convergence in biology, a similar environment caused the development of a technology. And societies all evolve. And some of them, I think they're actually evolved pretty predictably as well. But they will evolve.
That gets complicated.
Yeah. They evolve at different rates depending on who's there, what's going on, blah, blah, blah. But you can watch cultures and civilizations evolve and develop and eventually collapse, as they all will. They just will. And that's important to understand, because that's where we see the different technologies like writing develop. And we're just using writing as an example because writing gets abused a lot, especially in the fringe groups.
Yeah, because one, it's a great example of independent invention, but two, if you're looking at alternative archaeologies,
right,
it's often really one of the big things you see.
And this is why we were harping on apophenia, why this is important, because one of the favorite things of the fringe to use as evidence to support the idea that all of these cultures were diffused from a larger mother culture is, ooh, look at these similarities in writing and language.
Yeah.
And just because you see a similarity does not mean, actually, it almost assuredly does not mean that there is a connection between these two cultures.
And this idea goes all the way back to the 16th century,
yes,
when Europeans started seeing other writing systems. So as weird as it may sound, Chinese writing was not really well known or known at all in Europe until the later 16th century, later 1500s. I actually found that out relatively recently. I'm like, that's frankly shocking.
That's really late.
But yeah, it is. Well, Europe was a backwater.
That's true.
And I mean, I suspect the Romans knew more about it, but when we're talking about more recently, they didn't know much about it. And of course, this is also when they run into writing in the Americas, when they run into it in what they called Mexican writing, but in the Aztec world, they had writing, and in the Maya world, they had writing. And when they ran into these, now they knew about hieroglyphs, they knew about Egyptian. And when they would run into these, they very quickly would say, oh, these are all the same. These are all very similar. They're all related. And they would create these, even though they couldn't read any of them.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't read a single line of any of them. Well, Chinese, I guess they could eventually. They created these hierarchies, and they tried to argue that what it was going back to the Old Testament story of the Tower of Babel.
Yeah. When
the Tower of Babel, or Babylon, Babel is, that's where we get the word babble, babbling. The idea that they had tried to build a tower to the sky in hubris, and this was smote down, and humanity was cursed with having all of its languages being made diverse so people couldn't understand each other. The argument was that these writing systems, which were not alphabetic, must be an earlier, almost pre-linguistic version of writing going back to that. And only when really the 18th century and you see the Enlightenment start to, does that idea begin to fall apart. But for a long time, these things were thought to be almost sacred. That's in fact where the word hieroglyphs kind of becomes really ubiquitous. But yeah, there's this idea, as soon as they didn't understand what they were, it's like, this must all be connected. It must be all part of a big plan. It must be a pattern. Well, that's apophenia, actually.
Right. And that's being biased and not realizing it. And thankfully, some people were able to start studying these things and go, wait, okay, these aren't the same. And then started really studying them and started breaking them down. And now we know the timelines, we know the development lines, we have physical evidence of these older forms of writing, which is important because... Well, go ahead.
Well, the other thing I was going to say was with pareidolia, the seeing of things that are not there. So apophenia is pattern recognition, and that doesn't have to be seen. That could be like numerology where, well, if I do this, then 7 days later, it's magical thinking in that sense.
Right.
But pareidolia is visual or sonic, audio, like seeing or hearing things in patterns that should not be there. So again, it's the face in your cloud or your electrical plate or your car.
Or your toast.
At the end, what's that?
Or your toast.
Oh yes, seeing Willie Nelson in your toast. But where this applies to writing, and this actually gets into alternative archaeology, is now Maya writing. Although people will try to make up all kinds of things, and we actually talked about this with the the Mu stones, like, Ken asked, like, does this look at anything like, anything in Mesoamerica? It's like, no, it doesn't.
Right.
There are people who try to do that, but generally Maya writing is often these weird full body glyphs. I love Maya writing. And some people find it hard to see. They call it spaghetti. But if you know what you're looking at, it's often very complex artwork. But a lot of writing around the world is basically lines. Even Egyptian, some of it's pictures, but a lot of it's just kind of like lines that crisscross, lines at angles. And if it's eroded down, it even gets worse. And you think of an alphabet. An alphabet's really just lines and squiggles and curves.
Right.
There's only so many ways you can put together lines and squiggles and curves, and then you hand in like individual variation, and all of a sudden you will see some cases where that looks like something, but maybe it's not. So the classic example of this, and I think you guys have brought him up before, was marine biologist, not archaeologist, not epigrapher, Barry Fell, who was arguing that he was seeing Phoenician or Ogham. Now, Ogham is what we call sort of a secondary writing system. It's not an independent invention of writing. The symbols are all independently invented, but it was basically an alphabet inspired by the alphabets of the Mediterranean. It's sort of like the alphabet of Northern Europe for a few centuries, but it was inspired by the ones that existed farther south. So that's not independent entirely. And it's not unrelated in some ways. Like runes are the same sort of thing. Runes are clearly inspired by the alphabets from the south, but they are sort of quasi-independently invented. He was going around various rocks in North America and saying, oh, this is Northern European or this is Phoenician alphabets. And then people who actually studied these things for a living would go, no, you're seeing things that aren't really there. And in some cases, it was even argued that he was misinterpreting plow scars, rocks that were found in fields that farmers had run their plows with their steel or iron blades across. And if you've seen Ogham, well, an Ogham expert will go, okay, that's clearly Ogham or not. For most people, like that kind of just looks like a bunch of lines.
Well, the interesting thing about Barry Fell and the Ogham is Barry Fell's Ogham in America never contains vowels. So it was proposed, and I don't know if it was proposed by Barry Fell or by a Barry Fellite, because he has quite a following even today.
Oh, yeah.
But it was proposed that there are two forms of Ogham. There is the actual Ogham that is used overseas.
And then crazy Ogham.
And then there's American Ogham, which does not have vowels. So it's like Hebrew or something.
Because why not?
Well, it's the only way to explain it, because even if you look at Barry Fell's translations, his translations are always missing vowels. So you could kind of interpret them any way you really want to interpret them, much like you can when you're missing vowels, So that's interesting. So Barry Fell basically not only had these weird ideas of what Ogham and even the runes, like he would find runes and everything as well.
Why not?
Old Norse runes.
Why not?
Because they're a collection of crisscrossing and parallel lines.
Yeah.
And it's the same kind of thing. But yeah, so not only did he see these everywhere he went, he basically invented his own system of writing to justify the weird crap that he thought he was seeing everywhere.
That's actually really funny you put it that way. Athenaeus Kircher in the 17th century was sort of the expert in Italy and Europe on Egyptian hieroglyphs. He couldn't read them, by the way, but he was nonetheless the world expert because he was, in fact, a scholar. Just because you're a scholar doesn't necessarily mean you know what you're talking about. But he was a scholar of this, and he actually made up his own hieroglyph system. He wasn't saying it was the Egyptian system, but he made up his own anyway on top of that. And not saying it was ancient, but just like almost like this is my symbolic language. How do you like that?
Yeah.
And he wasn't the only one who did that. So I just, my sigh there, I sometimes actually purposely don't know certain things because I still like to be horrified and surprised when I hear things I did not actually know. That you know what? I think I had heard that, but I had suppressed it.
I didn't know about it, honestly. I mean, obviously I knew about Barry Fell. I knew about Barry Fell. Still affects us till today. But in the
1970s, he was more famous as an alternative archaeologist than Eric von Daniken.
Yeah. And his translations of plow scars are still an issue today. I think he like translated some writing out at Mystery. Yeah, actually, he translated some of the Ogham out at Mystery Hill, and that's how I found out about this American Ogham. I'm just like, are you serious?
Have you been there?
I have not, but Ken has gone a bunch of times. I really need to go. I'm not I mean, I'm far enough away. It's a bit of a trip, but it's not like an insurmountable trip to go.
The one time I went up there, I ended up not going not for reasons when I normally say the word reasons, but like for other reasons. And I kind of kicked myself for not going. I really should have in retrospect. But anyway, I just was curious if you'd gone.
I know they have berry picking and llamas. So, I mean, if nothing else, you can get berries.
I knew about their paranormal events. I didn't know about the llamas.
Yeah, apparently they keep livestock and allow people to come in. I mean, they got to pay the bills.
Yeah. Llamas.
I mean, it's a farm site. So you're using it for literally what it was used for.
Olmec of like, say, the middle pre-classic, say 600 BCE. There are some folks who try to tie it into Shang Chinese writing, and they point to scratches and symbols on jades in Olmec sites like Levanta that we're not even certain are writing, or if they are, they might even be representations of like more full. We just don't even know. Right. And one of the things actually with writing systems is the less we know about it, the more kind of alternative BS you'll often hear about them, which is not really a big surprise in any real sense.
No, because it's easy to misinterpret something that the experts can't come back and say, no, you're wrong on.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's my understanding we don't know we know a lot about the Olmec culture, but we don't know fine details about the Olmec culture. And that doesn't mean that the Olmec culture is African or Chinese or whatever variety of not Native American you're trying to make it be this year.
Yeah, no, it gets really complicated, and even there are some Mesoamericanists who would argue that Olmec is simply a label that we use. It wouldn't even necessarily be a culture that existed. It's just the grander Mesoamerica that we happen to call Olmec in some places, and that's really beyond what we're talking. Well, I mean, it's not in a sense.
No, it's a perfectly reasonable accusation, but I mean, we don't know.
Well, and we're about to go to break in a minute or so, but that actually brings up the point that even archaeologists are well aware that they are dealing with representations and patterns. And some people will see patterns where other people will go, you're grouping together things that really shouldn't be grouped together.
Right.
But they will argue about criteria. At least we hope they do. They will argue about, well, why are you saying this? When you say Olmec, well, what does that mean?
Right.
And that can sometimes get testy. But the fact that we have those arguments is actually kind of why I can call archaeology a science versus what I think you often see in a lot of these alternative circles, and I think we can kind of take it to break and talk about another topic, but one of these things you often see is somebody will say a thing, and as long as it's not the mainstream, they'll take what they like out of that and then say another thing. And somebody will say another thing, and it'll become this patchwork, this house of cards, to mix metaphors, of...
You mean it's an independent evolution of ideas?
Oh, no.
Well, it's not even independent, though, is it?
That's the thing, is I think you can often actually suggest that there are key things. This is why when I've come on, I often throw around the words Victorian and Neo-Victorian, because a lot of this sort of steals from the era back when this was much more acceptable.
Right.
And in fact, one of the things that sort of often is diagnostic, as Garrett Fagan would say, of what is called alternative or pseudo-archaeology is exactly how much does it look like 1888.
That's an excellent point. All right, let's go to break real quick. And when we come back, we will look at some more examples of independent invention in the archaeological record.
Telling a different story to the traditional lines of archaeology, the Anarchaeologist podcast seeks the stories and ideas that are often overlooked or not considered real archaeology. Video games, anarchism, and archaeology in the middle of hostile areas. Host Tristan doesn't search under the rocks. He destroys them. Available on iTunes every fortnight.
Want a website with unmatched power, speed, and control? Try Bluehost Cloud, the new web hosting plan from Bluehost, built for WordPress creators by WordPress experts. With 100% uptime, incredible load times, and 24/7 WordPress priority support, your sites will be lightning fast with global reach. And with Bluehost Cloud, your sites can handle surges in traffic no matter how big. Plus, you automatically get daily backups and world-class security. Get started now at Bluehost.com.
And we are back, and we're still talking about convergence and independent invention. And another really great example, at least from my opinion, is all of the different earthworks that you can find around the world. And this is another one that gets argued by the fringe a lot as, oh, look, evidence of influence from culture X on culture Y. And we already touched on the mound builders a little bit, but even today, you will see people who will say things like, oh, Serpent Mound in Ohio isn't actually a Native American site. That was put there by the Celtic prince Murdoch on his travels to the southern part of the United States, because that's what you do when you're Celtic. You come over to another continent.
Before he traveled there, he had to put some sleeping powder in milk for B.A. Baracus when they went down there. And if you get that, you're old and you have terrible taste in television. So anyway.
Hey, 18 was awesome. Shut up.
Yes. Hey, I'm the one who made the reference.
But yeah, no, you see that a lot. And that's just one example. Some of the things that earthworks are being blamed on more recently that I have seen are giants. Andy White, who's been a guest on this show before, has touched on the concept of giants building the earthworks that you see across the United States. Obviously,
because why not? Why not?
Right. The Celts, obviously. A lot of times I see people say, especially when you find any of these kind of more northern than southern in the States, or you'll hear people say that they are Viking in nature, that they're not actually Native American. They're Viking burial mounds, and here's where the diffusionism comes in, and is that the Vikings, because we know that they got here, but obviously they came here and taught the Native Americans how to bury their dead in earthen mounds, and then the Native Americans, because remember, they're all the same thing, just ran with that idea and decided to build their own burial mounds, and then started building other giant earthworks because they were already building burial mounds. So why not build something else?
And let's just put this out there. Piling dirt is a very difficult and non-intuitive technology.
Right. No one would ever think to make a pile of dirt ever.
Yeah. No child's done that.
Right.
Never done that at the beach.
Right. Sarcasm aside, just in case you weren't aware. But yeah, actually, mound building and earthworks are probably one of the most intuitive things to do.
Yeah.
I mean, when we're looking at cultures overseas and we start seeing the development of larger, I want to say megaliths, but I'm not positive that's
megaliths are the same thing, where you have big stones being piled on each other or put in circles.
Right.
It's the exact same thing. And that was one of the classics where before radiocarbon, as we talked about in the hyperdiffusion, people like, oh, they're working in big stones. That must have come from places where they built pyramids because they work in big stones. Mm-hmm. And then they found out that the ones from France and Spain and Britain were older.
Right. And a lot of times they find an association with these stone megaliths. They're finding earthen mounds that are older. So you're actually seeing the development of this building technology. Stonehenge is a perfect example. Before the stones were put into place, at least they're finding this out now, before all of those beautiful giant stones are in place, the landscape itself was altered.
There was a cursus, there was a henge. I mean, henge just basically means circle.
Right.
And not only that, many megalithic sites, especially the ones that look all just piled on each other, were actually part of earthen mounds, and many what we call barrow mounds have a section that may be stone. They're not unrelated technologies.
Right. They almost always go hand in hand. One of them always usually predates the other, and they develop independently. Because we're seeing the development of them overseas, we see the development of them here in the northern part of the Americas. We also see them a lot in Southern America. I know it's a thing. I don't know how much of a thing it is, but I know that they do earthen pyramids. in the Mayan cultures and some of the cultures that predate the Mayan.
You have earthen mounds in much of the Maya region until about, I mean, you have even a little later, but until about 300 BCE. For example, Tazumal, which I'll be talking about later on, possibly on a show. At Tazumal, eventually you have big stone pyramids, adobe pyramids, but the version of what's the larger side of Chalchuapa in the pre-classic is a big freaking earthen mound. But once you start to have stone architecture, then you see basically they're doing the same thing, but they're making them out of beautiful stones.
Right.
But yeah, no, you do have them there. In Colombia, you have people taking basaltic columns or other stones and piling them one on top of the other. And if you stuck that, well, it would look geologically weird. You'd be like, where the hell these stones come from? You put it in Ireland. But the idea of basically taking columns and sticking them on each other is not a terrible surprise because, well, why wouldn't you do that?
Right. I mean, it's a basic building technique. Ken says this all the time with the pyramids things. I dare you to build a structure that isn't pyramidal in concept from the beginning. A pyramid or anything like that, a conchial device, is going to be stable.
It's a pile. It's
right.
a pile of things.
Right.
A pyramid is just a really nicely organized pile of things.
Right.
That's all it is.
And earth mounds are kind of the same concept. And, you can see them develop. They start off as piles, just mounds. And then you start seeing them develop into, you see earthen walls around the Ohio mound sites are beautiful for this. All of these earth fortifications built around giant freaking cities that we didn't realize existed until we started really looking at the earth and the landscape and seeing these mounds everywhere. And you also see them develop into animal shapes or just abstract shapes. It's debatable if Serpent Mound is actually a serpent or if just like an abstract shape or something. And you can...
It is pretty serpenty looking.
It is pretty serpenty. I think we don't know what the head is.
Yeah, that gets all complicated.
We still argue over what the head is supposed to be, and if that even is the head.
Right.
So there's that, but that's neither here nor there. My point is very much like the writing. These earthworks and these megaliths do not develop unless the cultural and social environment is right. And that's how we know that these things are developing independently, because we can look at the societies and the stages that these societies were in at the time that these things were built to see what it was like. And it's very much like the writing situation. In order to build these big earthen mounds and these big megaliths, you have to have a stable society with a hierarchy, and probably you have some form of communication associated with it.
Not to be a unilineal evolutionist, and we were sort of hinting at this earlier, earthen mounds appear in different contexts. In some cases, for example, in the Midwestern United States, it's where you have a mix of some farming, but mostly foraging economy, but you're starting to have more settled people. Right. You're starting to have a more complex economy. You're starting to have emergent elites, but not the same level of centralization as when you have big stone pyramids and writing. Well, if you go around the world, not every case, but most of them are kind of like that.
Yeah, I know the ones in Africa.
It's not because they're connected. It's because you've got similar sorts of social contexts.
I know the ones in Africa. I want to say in the Central African continent. I don't think those are associated with agricultural peoples, but they are associated with larger groupings of...
Well, I mean, the ones in the Midwest aren't really agricultural. They're pre corn bean squash. I mean, there's sump wheat and things, but they're not primarily agricultural economies.
But they are larger societies.
Yes, but not as centralized as you get. Now, the one difference here is, of course, when you start to get into the Mississippi and get into Cahokia, but then you have massive differences of scale.
Exactly.
So even though they're still building with earth, usually, although there are some examples of using stone in North America, it's just they're not common and not like a full pyramid, nonetheless, you can see a difference. I mean, there's a difference. I mean, like, Miamisburg Mound near me is impressive. It's not Monk's Mound at Cahokia. There's a big difference between those
very
two.
little is Monk's Mound at Cahokia. Which, if you get the chance, you should totally go see and try climbing up it.
Or if you're in Ohio and you haven't seen Miamisburg Mound, go see it. It's like 70 feet tall. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in Ohio,
it's a freaking pyramid near Dayton.
Yeah, if you're in Ohio and you haven't gone and seen the mounds, then any of the mounds, there are mounds everywhere. You're really doing yourself a disservice. The complexity and the uses of the mounds are different too, because early on they're used as like territory markers and burial things.
And those are not unrelated. Those are often similar things. We're like, oh, look, my ancestors' bones are here.
Exactly.
This is our land.
And they can, probably pretty often they were used as both. But then you also see them, like I said, get more complicated. You start seeing them being used as structures, being used as fortification.
They're social places. I mean,
Right.
These tombs are not just sealed up. People go into them. This is why, for example, in Europe, you often see heavy astronomical alignments with these things.
Right.
And you see that in the Midwest, where it's often lunar, whereas it's very solar in Europe.
Right. And that, again, that's showing us that these were developing independently. Because if these were all developed by one person who just kind of passed it all down, then they would all be solar or they would all be lunar. Probably you wouldn't see very much variance there.
Well, maybe there were two brothers. Maybe they had an argument. Let's make a myth.
There we go.
Anyway.
That's
not that far off.
One was taken and raised by the moon.
Oh, God.
I can do this. I can do this all day. Anyway. So these are two very large, very noticeable things that we see with convergence and independent invention. Smaller things, and we've sort of talked about this. Pottery. We've argued about the noodle.
There's only so many things you can do with clay. I mean,
there really is.
Not only that, not just only so many things you can do with clay. There's only so many things you can do with clay to cook things on fire or to eat them at dinner. I mean, you're going to have somewhat similarities, and that's not going to be terribly shocking.
Well, one of the interesting things about the development of pottery is it seems, at least this is the last that I heard, it may have been updated since then, but it seems that the development of pottery kind of co-evolved with the development of baking and the concept of making breads out of various materials.
Not necessarily. The oldest pottery in the world now is from China. It often was considered to be the early Jamon pottery from Japan. It's now China, almost 20,000 years ago. And by pottery, I mean, pots.
Pinch pots and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that you fire in the ceramic. And what it seems to go along with sedentism, because why would you carry something that's heavy and fragile?
Exactly.
Yeah. But it's long before farming. We used to associate pottery, I think, because of the Middle East, heavily with farming. And clearly, farmers are going to be more likely to have pots than mobile hunter-gatherers. But if you've got sedentary hunter-gatherers in similar ecological contexts, pottery is a fairly obvious thing. Especially if you're a sedentary hunter-gatherer, you're probably near a river. It's not guaranteed, but there's a good chance that you are. So you're going to have clays to play with. It's tied to baking to some degree, but it's really just tied to, because the earliest pottery in Japan, unsurprisingly, was used for seafood. Not really a big surprise. It's Japan. And China, it's used for wild rice and all these things. It's more about the social context. And that's the thing. These are technologies.
Right.
Technologies make sense as adaptations in social contexts. Can you track them sometimes around the world? Sure, but they also do emerge when they make sense.
Right, and it's another one of those things. Invention is the mother of necessity. And I think Ken and I have touched on this a little bit in the, or maybe I was just tutoring, but there's a line in the lower part of Europe going up into Asia where we don't see stone tools. And there was a lot of speculation early on as to why.
I think you're talking about where you see Acheulean hand axes and where you don't.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't think that's as secure as it used to be.
Oh, really? Well, I remember
I'm not certain about that.
Well, I remember the arguments and the speculation back when I was being taught this, that we weren't sure why that was occurring, and maybe we are now, and maybe we're finding stuff now. I think that's entirely possible.
I think they're finding some, but not as many. And these Acheulean hand axes are the first purposely shaped by Homo erectus, the first member of our genus to spread out of Africa. These teardrop-shaped axes, but they generally were not being found east of India. And there was a specific name for the line. I forget what it was.
Right.
I think some Acheulean-like things, but not exactly the same, have been found east of that line, but they're far more likely to be found west of that line.
Right. Now, obviously this has all been updated since last time I was taught this in school, but there used to be an idea that there, of course, was the very crass idea that, well, obviously the people on the other side of that line were just stupid and couldn't work tools, couldn't work stone. And then we decided that that was ridiculous. So then we decided, well, maybe it was because they had a better material. And that's where the speculation of bamboo tools has come up.
Right.
I don't know I don't know if that still has legs these days. I know you can make some pretty good tools out of bamboo.
Bamboo's amazing stuff. I mean, I've heard this idea. And I mean, I can't think of any like very obvious Acheulean hand axes found from China or Southeast Asia, but I do know a few things that are like, kind of, sort of. And it's hard, but the fact that we sort of argue about this again sort of makes the point.
Well, and my point with the example here of the bamboo tools versus the stone tools is, if your culture either has better materials or doesn't have a need for those things, they're probably not going to develop them. That doesn't mean that they're stupid or that the aliens haven't gotten to them yet. It means that they have found other ways to solve a problem, or they don't have that problem. I know that, I think it's up where Ken works, they don't really have a lot of pottery because everything was done with baskets.
Yeah, there's not a lot. I think there's a couple of reasons. But there's certain parts of the U.S. where you have, not where Ken is, but a little farther south, where you have all these steatite bowls, these kind of soft soapstone bowls,
right,
where ceramics eventually replaced them, but they were already kind of doing the same thing with these bowls because it was really soft soapstone, hence
and it
the
was
name.
just easy to carve.
Yeah, no, and you have jadeite. You have jadeite used for hard axes that are basically like steel. They're tougher to work. They're not as easy to work. They're not the same in terms of social economy, but from a technological perspective, they do the job.
Right, exactly. And so this is another aspect of convergence and independent development. They are, and then probably this even makes the point more, because you're using completely different materials to make a very similar object to do the same thing. And that, I think, drives the point home more than anything. It's not just that you have everybody's making pots out of the exact same thing at varying times, but they're doing it independently. That's cool. But when you start seeing the problem solving at the societal and at the cultural level, but yet you're still achieving the same results, I think that argues stronger for convergence and for independent invention than hyperdiffusionism will ever cover.
Well, here's a perfect example going back to writing. I didn't mention South America. There's no hieroglyphs in South America. There's no what we would call writing. But in Peru, and we don't know exactly how old it is. It may go back all the way to Caral in the Supe Valley. We're not entirely certain. But the Inca, for example, had something called quipu, these knotted strings that clearly contain information of some kind.
Right.
And specialists could read them, but it's not writing. In the sense of it's not written on a wall, it's not written. And the big question has been, we can't read them now. Well, not entirely. There's been some recent breakthroughs in that. But the big question is, does it record language? But let's say it doesn't. Let's say it doesn't. Let's say it's just like music. Musical notation is not language, but it records complex information. It's not language. It's not linguistic, but it records complex information. So let's say, the Inca Empire was incredibly organized, far more organized than anything in Mesoamerica. But they didn't have writing. But this thing did what they needed.
Exactly.
In Mesoamerica, the Mixtec have these beautiful books that have like people walking around and they're doing things. They're history books. They are nowhere near as linguistically complex as, say, Maya writing. Whether it's writing or not becomes, you get people who say it isn't, that gets really angry debate, but nobody would argue that they're the same technologically. But their role in society is basically the same.
Right.
They glorify the ruler and they help tell the story of the past, and they're used in the same way. So these are not the same texts, but technologies emerged nonetheless to basically do what they needed for similar purposes.
Well, I mean, you can see the same thing with the Peruvian Nazca lines and, like bear mounds. The bear mounds and the serpent mounds.
Effigy mounds.
Effigy mounds, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Those are effectively, as far as we can tell, kind of the same thing. They're representing...
Yeah, they're all meant to signal to the aliens and their flying saucers.
Exactly, to tell them where to land. But the Nazca lines are the removal of stone to expose paler stone beneath.
This is scratching the desert floor.
Right, and effectively you are subtracting material to get your effect, and the effigy mounds are the addition of material to, and it's two different materials. You've got stone versus earth.
Right. Well, and the Nazca Valley, the floor is not going to be easily overgrown. It's really dry.
Right.
Whereas Ohio, trees.
Exactly.
So if you want to see this thing next year, you got to go up.
Exactly.
Instead of go down.
But it's solving the same problem. It's achieving the same goal, probably, using completely different materials for different reasons.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think these examples drive the point home quite nicely. Where, I mean, even things like writing and the pottery and the earthen mounds in general, those are great examples, and they get misinterpreted. And Ken points out that they get misinterpreted because they're big and they're splashy and everybody can see them and they're wow and all that. And it's the little stuff that is the really important stuff. I mean, the mounds and everything are really important, but it's the little details that get missed.
Oh, yeah.
That are very important to the story as well.
I have an exercise where I have my students look at kind of alternative archaeology in class, and some of them really love the idea of the Shang and the Olmec being related. And I'm like, great. So the Shang, what are they famous for? Oh, they're bronzes. How much bronze is in Mesoamerica?
Right.
How much rice? How many oxen? Oh, none of their technology came across. So they only brought this one thing in their love of jade and brought nothing else?
Right.
Well, that's frankly kind of dickish.
And makes no sense. Why would you go to a completely foreign land and not take the things that you are aware of with you? You know, the things that you are familiar with you.
Because you're just rude.
Right? Like, I'm not going to share.
Yeah.
You can have this, but nothing else.
Just this, nothing more.
That's the thing with the aliens that I always like to laugh about. Is like, these aliens, they come across the universe and they're crazy ships and with all their technology, and they're communicating sublingually and all this great stuff, and they've got computers and gold and platinum and wires and all this stuff, and they teach humans to record it by chiseling it onto stone.
Oh yeah, or even better, they teach humans in South America how to very carefully fit stones together. You know what they don't teach them? How to make second floors on those buildings, because you generally don't have that in Andean architecture because they're really heavy. So it's like they can go from the stars, but a second floor walk up, not so much.
Well, those stones were actually melted and poured into place, right?
Apparently, if you really don't care about anything. Yeah.
We should talk about that sometime. That's hilarious.
Yeah, no, I think we should.
The melting and pouring of rocks. Okay, well, Jeb, thank you very much. This has been great.
Yes, and I am going to go independently invent something now. I'm not sure what, because I'm human. It will come to me.
All right, man. Thank you very much.
All right.
And I will
talk to you later.
Trials as one will call. No, we don't do a dinosaur.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher, and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at archifantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Hey there, entrepreneurs. What's the easiest choice you can make? Outsourcing tasks you hate. What about selling with Shopify? Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage, Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. With their all-in-one e-commerce platform and in-person POS system, Shopify's got you covered. Shopify helps turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout, 36% better on average. Plus, you can sell more with less effort thanks to Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. I love how Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/dax, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/dax now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. That's shopify.com/dax.